On a dark night in the 13th century, in the icy Pyrenees Mountains, a mercenary soldier made the most terrible mistake of his life. He laughed at the Virgin Mary. He mocked her sacred image. And what happened next defied all the laws of nature and human reason. This is not just a story of faith. It is a documented account that spans centuries, witnessed by dozens of people, recorded in ancient parchments, and forever changed the life of an entire city. This soldier's name was Rodrigo de Moncada, and his arrogance would cost him far more than he could ever have imagined. Prepare to experience one of the most shocking miracles ever recorded in human history. But before we begin this extraordinary journey, you need to know that this story contains elements that may shake your deepest convictions about what is possible or impossible in this world. To fully understand this extraordinary miracle, we must go back to the year 1247, during the reign of Saint Louis IX in France. Europe was experiencing a period of intense territorial conflicts, where mercenary soldiers roamed the roads in search of work and wealth. Rodrigo de Moncada was one such man. Tall, robust, with scars that told stories of countless battles. He commanded a small group of mercenaries who specialized in solving problems for those who could pay well. His reputation was known from the fields of Catalonia to the Pyrenees Mountains. Born into a family of decadent minor nobles, Rodrigo lost his faith early in life. At 16, he saw his father die on a crusade that promised glory and wealth but brought only misery. His mother, a woman deeply devoted to the Virgin Mary, spent years praying for his return, only to die of grief upon learning of her husband's death. From that moment on, Rodrigo cultivated a profound contempt for all things religious. For him, faith was a tool of manipulation for the powerful, a way to keep the people submissive while the truly clever accumulated wealth through force of arms. This radical skepticism transformed into something far more dangerous: active blasphemy. Rodrigo not only rejected the faith, he publicly attacked it, mocked sacred symbols, and encouraged his men to do the same. In the fall of 1247, Rodrigo and his 12 companions received a lucrative offer. A wealthy merchant from Barcelona hired their services to escort a caravan of precious goods to Lyon. The pay was generous: 100 gold coins for each man, plus a bonus if they arrived on time. The chosen route passed through a mountainous region known for its natural beauty, but also for its dangers. Bandits frequently attacked unprotected travelers, and winter was fast approaching, making the roads even more treacherous. On the third day of their journey, the group reached a small village called Sainte Marie de Neige, a name that ironically meant Saint Mary of the Snows. The village was known for its particular devotion to the Virgin Mary, manifested through an ancient chapel built atop a hill overlooking the region. The chapel, according to locals, housed a miraculous image of the Virgin Mary that had been carved by a hermit in the 11th century. It was said that the image wept real tears in times of great danger to the community, and that prayers before it were always answered. The mercenaries decided to spend the night in the village, staying at the only available inn. The owner, a kind man named Jacques Dupont, welcomed them with typical regional hospitality, offering them the best food and accommodations his modest establishment could afford. During dinner, Jacques began to tell stories about the chapel and the miracles attributed to the image of the Virgin Mary. His eyes shone with devotion as he recounted inexplicable healings, protection from devastating storms, and even apparitions of the Virgin herself to local shepherds. It was then that Rodrigo made his first mistake. If you're enjoying this extraordinary story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any of our accounts of authentic miracles that have transformed lives throughout history. With a loud, sarcastic laugh, Rodrigo interrupted Jacques' story. "Old superstitions of ignorant people," he said, banging his fist on the table, making the glasses rattle. "Weeping images? Miracles? All of these are nothing more than tricks to extract money from fools. The silence that followed was deathly. Everyone in the inn, about 20 people, both locals and travelers, stopped what they were doing to look at the soldier. Jacques paled, but maintained his Christian composure. "Sir," he said softly, "I understand that not everyone shares our faith, but I ask that you respect our traditions while you are in our land." Rodrigo stood, staggering slightly from the wine he had consumed. His men watched him with a mixture of amusement and apprehension. They knew well their leader's explosive temper when provoked. "Respect," he shouted. "Why should I respect lies? This so-called Virgin Mary of yours, where was she when my father died fighting in the name of Christ? Where was she when my mother wasted away praying for a miracle that never came?" The words came like stabs, each one laden with years of accumulated bitterness. But Rodrigo didn't stop there. "You expect me to believe that a wooden statue can weep? That a woman dead for over 1,000 years can hear your pathetic pleas?" he continued, his voice echoing off the stone walls of the inn. "If this Virgin Mary of yours has so much power, let her come here now and prove it to me." A murmur of horror ran through the crowd. Several women crossed themselves quickly, and some men stood up as if ready to defend the honor of their patron saint. But Jacques raised his hand, urging calm. "Mr. Rodrigo," he said, his voice still controlled but trembling with emotion, "what you're saying borders on blasphemy. Our Lady is patient and merciful. But what?" Rodrigo interrupted, now completely overcome with anger and alcohol. "Is she going to punish me? With thunder and lightning? With curses and curses?" He headed for the inn's door, followed by the horrified looks of everyone present. "I'm going to this ridiculous chapel of yours," he announced. "I'm going to look this statue in the eye and tell it exactly what I think of it. And when nothing happens, perhaps you'll finally understand that you've wasted your entire lives worshipping pieces of wood." Despite Jacques' protests and the villagers' pleas, Rodrigo left the inn and headed for the hill where the chapel of Sainte Marie stood. 3 of his most loyal men, Henri of Flanders, Paolo Grimaldi, and Thomas of Normandy, followed him, more out of loyalty than conviction. The night was particularly dark. Thick clouds obscured the moon and stars, creating a somber atmosphere that seemed to presage extraordinary events. The wind howled through the pines that covered the mountainside, carrying with it a bone-piercing chill. The path to the chapel was steep and rocky, winding through rocks and dense vegetation. Normally, it took about 30 minutes to walk, but in near total darkness, the 4 men needed almost an hour to reach their destination. The Sainte Marie de Neige chapel was a modest building, yet striking in its austere simplicity. Made entirely of local stone, its thick walls and small Gothic windows gave it an appearance at once welcoming and majestic. An octagonal bell tower towered above the complex, crowned by a wrought iron cross that seemed to touch the clouds. At the main entrance, a solid oak door was locked with a simple lock. The locals had never felt the need to protect their chapel from intruders. To them, the place was so sacred that the very idea of desecration seemed unthinkable. Rodrigo pushed the door with unnecessary force, causing it to slam against the interior wall with a loud bang that echoed through the empty building. His footsteps echoed across the polished stone floor as he advanced toward the main altar. The chapel was lit only by a few never-extinguished votive candles, kept alight by the constant devotion of the faithful. The flickering light created dancing shadows on the walls, decorated with simple frescoes depicting scenes from the lives of Christ and Mary. And there, in the center of the main altar, she stood. The image of the Virgin Mary of Sainte Marie de Neige was an extraordinary work of art, even by the standards of the time. Carved from cedar wood, It stood approximately 4 feet tall, and was crafted with a delicacy that bordered on the impossible for the tools available in the 11th century. The Virgin's face radiated a transcendent serenity. Her eyes, painted with a technique that seemed to give them a life of their own, gazed directly at anyone who approached the altar, conveying both maternal compassion and divine wisdom. A sky-blue cloak, decorated with microscopic golden stars, covered her head and shoulders, flowing in folds that seemed to move in the candlelight. Her hands were positioned in a posture of prayer and blessing, her fingers delicately intertwined. Small details, like the carefully sculpted nails and the subtle lines indicating the joints, demonstrated the love and devotion with which the anonymous artist had crafted every inch of the work. But what was most striking was the image's overall expression. There was something about it that transcended human art, an intangible quality that made even the most hardened skeptics feel small and humble in its presence. It was as if the very essence of divine motherhood had been captured in the dead wood and transformed into something eternally alive. Around the base of the image, hundreds of ex-votos left by the faithful over the centuries created a mosaic of faith and gratitude. Small metal plaques engraved with thanks, personal objects offered in exchange for graces received, and even crutches abandoned by people who claimed to have been miraculously cured. Rodrigo stopped before the image, his 3 companions a few steps behind. For a moment, even he seemed touched by the sacred atmosphere of the place. His breathing slowed, his posture less aggressive. But then, the bitterness of years of disillusionment returned to him. "So it's you," Rodrigo said, his voice echoing through the chapel's vaults. "The famous Virgin Mary of Saint Marie de Neige. The one who supposedly protects these simple and credulous people." He approached the altar, his heavy steps contrasting with the sacred silence of the room. "Look at me," he continued, pointing his finger at the image's serene face. "I am Rodrigo de Moncada, son of a man who died believing in your empty promises. I come here tonight to tell you some truths." Henri, Paulo, and Thomas glanced at each other nervously. Even though they were rough men accustomed to violence, there was something in the atmosphere that made them feel uneasy. An indefinable presence that seemed to watch them from the shadows. "You were nothing more than an ordinary Jewish girl who lived over 1,000 years ago," Rodrigo continued, his voice growing in intensity. "There is nothing divine about you. No supernatural powers. No miracles. Just the fantasies of desperate people who need to believe in something greater than their miserable lives. Ele subiu os 3 degraus que separavam a nave do presbiterio, aproximando se ainda mais de imagem. Minha me passo anos orando para você. Diz, agora sussurrando, mas suas palavras carregadas de veneno. Ela acendia velas, recitava rosarios, jejuava sua honra. E o que ela recebeu troca? Sofrimento. Solideo. Uma morte lenta e dolorosa. Esta historia está te tocando profundamente? Então você precisa acompanhar todos os nossos vídeos sobre milagres autênticos. Clique inscrever-se e ative o sininho para não perder nenhum relato extraordinário. As lágrimas começaram a correr pelo rosto do soldado endurecido, mas eram lágrimas de raiva, não de tristeza. Onde estava sua misericórdia quando ela mais precisava? Gritou ele. Onde estavam seus milagres quando coração puro e devoto implorava por sua intervenção? Então, Rodrigo fez algo que ninguém jamais havia usado fazer naquela capela sagrada. Ele estendeu a mão e tocou o rosto de imagem da Virgem Maria. Você não passa de madeira morta, diz, suas palavras sendo como uma sentença final. Madeira pintada que tolosa do ram como se faz divina. E para provar isso, o que aconteceu seguida mudaria para sempre não apenas a vida de Rodrigo, Mas de todos os presentes e de juracos futuros que o virium este relato. No momento exato que os dedos de Rodrigo tocaram o rosto esculpido de Virgem Maria, fenomeno extraordinario comico se manifestar. Primero, foi apenas uma sensação, calor suave que irradia do ponto de contato, subindo pelo braço do soldado como uma corrente elétrica benevolente. Rodrigo tentou retirar a mão, mas descobriu que não conseguia. Sus dedos pareciam ter sido delicadamente soldados a madeira sagrada, não por força física, mas por algo muito mais profundo e inexplicável. Ok. Comico ele, mas as palavras moram sua garganta quando vai o que estava acontecendo. Os olhos de imagem, que por séculos haviam olhado serenamente para frente, começaram a se mover lentamente e fixaram se diretamente nos olhos de Rodrigo. Não era uma ilusão causada pela luz tremelicente das velas ou pelo vinho que ele havia consumido. Era movimento real, deliberado, impossible. Henri, Paulo, and Thomas instinctively recoiled, their faces paling with terror. Paulo, a man who had faced entire armies without flinching, began to tremble violently. Lord Rodrigo, Thomas whispered, his voice barely audible. We must get out of here. Now. But Rodrigo couldn't move. His eyes were locked with those of the Virgin Mary, and in that gaze he saw something that shook the foundations of everything he believed in, or rather, everything he didn't believe in. It was a look of infinite compassion, but also of profound sadness. There was no condemnation or anger, as he had expected. There was only a maternal love that enveloped him like a warm embrace, penetrating through years of bitterness and disbelief until it reached the deepest recesses of his wounded soul. And then, she spoke. The voice that echoed through the chapel came from nowhere, and yet, at the same time, it seemed to come from everywhere. It was as gentle as a spring breeze, but carried an authority that made the very stones of the building seem to vibrate in harmony. Rodrigo, the voice said, and the soldier felt as if his own name were being spoken for the first time in his life. Wounded son, why do you carry so much hatred in your heart? Rodrigo's legs gave out, and he fell to his knees before the altar, his hands still mysteriously connected to the image's face. Tears began to well in his eyes. But this time they were tears of recognition of something that transcended his understanding. It's not possible, he murmured. You can't be real. I am as real as your pain, the voice replied, filled with a tenderness that melted centuries of skepticism in seconds. As real as the love your mother felt for you. As real as the prayers she raised to heaven for your salvation. Rodrigo's three companions embraced each other, unable to process what they were witnessing. Henri, the oldest of the group, began reciting fragments of prayers he had learned as a child and thought he had forgotten forever. But she died, Rodrigo protested, his voice cracking with emotion. She died begging for a sign from you, and you remained silent. I was never silent, the Virgin replied, and now Rodrigo could have sworn he saw her lips move gently. I was with her in every moment of pain, in every tear shed, in every whispered prayer. She knew it, even when you couldn't see it. The chapel walls seemed to pulse with a soft, golden light that came from no visible source. The air was filled with an indescribable scent, a mixture of roses, incense, and something more subtle that touched the soul directly. Then why? Rodrigo began, but the voice gently interrupted him. Why didn't I save her from death? She added. Because death is not the end, my son. It is merely a passage. Your mother is with me now, and she prays for you every moment of eternity. What happened next defied all the laws of physics and reality as humans understood it. The entire chapel began to transform, not physically, but in a way that transcended the normal senses. Rodrigo saw, or experienced, a vision that encompassed his entire life from birth to that moment. But it was no ordinary vision. It was as if he were simultaneously experiencing his own perspective and the divine perspective of each event. He saw his birth, and felt his mother's radiant love the moment she held him for the first time. He saw his father, not as the bitter and disillusioned man he had become, but as the idealistic young man who had gone off to the Crusades, genuinely believing he was serving a noble cause. He saw his mother praying, but now he understood that her prayers had never been ignored. Every plea had been heard, every tear had been collected, every moment of suffering had been shared by a divine presence that never abandoned her. He saw his own journey of lost faith, his choices that led him down the path of violence and skepticism. But even in the darkest moments, there was always a subtle light reaching out to him, an outstretched hand that he consistently rejected. "Do you see now?" the Virgin's voice asked, enveloping him like a cloak of understanding. Every moment of pain had a purpose. Every trial was an opportunity to grow in compassion. Every loss was a chance to discover what truly matters. Rodrigo understood, with a clarity that was both devastating and liberating, that he had wasted years of his life fighting against the love that had always been available to him. His rebellion against God had not harmed the divinity, it had only harmed himself and those around him. "But it's not too late," the Virgin continued. "It's never too late to return home." Slowly, Rodrigo felt his hand release from the image's face. But when he withdrew it, he discovered something that left him even more perplexed. On the palm of her right hand, there was now a mark, not a wound or a burn, but a delicate, perfectly formed image of a rose. The rose wasn't painted or tattooed on her skin. It was as if it had grown from within, an integral part of her flesh and bone, glowing with a soft, silvery light that illuminated her fingers. "This is my promise to you," the Virgin said, her voice now gradually fading like a distant echo. "As long as you live, this rose will remind you that you are never alone. And when your time comes to depart this world, it will guide you to me." The image's eyes slowly returned to their original position, staring once more into infinity with the same serene expression as ever. But for Rodrigo, nothing would ever be the same. He stood slowly, his legs still trembling from the transformative experience. His three companions watched him with a mixture of awe and terror, unable to articulate words in the face of what they had witnessed. "Gentlemen," Rodrigo said, his voice completely transformed, where before there had been arrogance and bitterness, there was now humility and wonder. "We have just witnessed the impossible." Henri approached cautiously, his eyes fixed on the luminous rose in Rodrigo's palm. "Lord," he whispered, What does all this mean?" Rodrigo looked at the image of the Virgin Mary, who now seemed to smile subtly in the candlelight. Then, for the first time in decades, he knelt in true prayer. "It means," he said, "that we were completely wrong about everything." If this story is transforming your perspective on miracles, you need to subscribe to our channel right now. We have hundreds of authentic accounts that will strengthen your faith and open your mind to the extraordinary. The descent from the hill was completely different from the ascent. While they had ascended like skeptical blasphemers in the darkness, they now descended like transformed men under a sky that seemed to have mysteriously illuminated. The rose in Rodrigo's hand emitted enough light to guide their steps, and a sense of profound peace had settled over them all. They didn't say much on the way back. Words seemed inadequate to express the magnitude of what they had experienced. When they arrived at the inn, they found a startling scene. Despite it being nearly midnight, all the villagers were awake, gathered in the main room of the establishment. Men, women, and children were talking in low tones, their faces etched with worry. Jacques Dupont was the first to see them enter. His face lit with relief, but quickly turned to bewilderment when he noticed the radical change in Rodrigo's expression and posture. "Mr. Rodrigo," he said hesitantly, we saw strange lights in the direction of the chapel. And there were sounds, voices in the wind. We feared that I had desecrated the sacred place." Rodrigo added softly, "Your fears were not unfounded, my good Jacques. I climbed that hill intending to do just that." A murmur of anxiety ran through the crowd. Some women hugged their children closer to their chests. "But," Rodrigo continued, raising his right hand so everyone could see the luminous rose, "something happened that changed not only my intentions, but my very soul." The silence that followed was absolute. All eyes fixed on the miraculous mark, which pulsed with a soft but unmistakable light. "The Virgin Mary spoke to me," Rodrigo said, his voice filled with wonder and humility. "She showed me truths I had rejected through years of stubbornness and pride. And she gave me this mark as proof of her infinite mercy." An elderly woman approached slowly, her trembling hands reaching out toward the luminous rose. Can I touch it?" she asked, her voice barely audible. Rodrigo reached out without hesitation. The moment the woman's fingers touched the rose, she let out a deep sigh and her tears began to flow. "I feel it," she whispered. "I feel the presence of Our Lady. It's as if she were here with us right now." In the days that followed, something extraordinary happened in Sainte Marie de Neige. News of the miracle spread like wildfire, first reaching neighboring villages and then expanding throughout the Pyrenees region. Rodrigo and his men cancelled their original mission. The Barcelona merchant would have to find other mercenaries to escort their caravan. They had found something far more valuable than gold, a true purpose for their lives. Rodrigo spent his days in the chapel, praying and meditating before the miraculous image. The rose in his hand not only continued to glow, but seemed to grow brighter with each passing day. And it wasn't just a symbol. The mark possessed properties that defied rational explanation. The first additional miracle occurred 3 days after the initial encounter. A child from the village, born with a severe spinal deformity that prevented him from walking, was brought by his parents for Rodrigo to lay his hands on. Initially reluctant, he was still processing his own transformation. Rodrigo finally agreed. When he touched the child with his rose-marked hand, something indescribable happened. A golden light enveloped them both, and when it dissipated, the child was standing, walking for the first time in his 8 years of life. News spread even more quickly. Pilgrims began arriving from far away, some traveling for weeks just to see the holy soldier, as Rodrigo became known. But he rejected any adoration directed at him. "I'm not a saint," he always insisted. "I'm just a sinner touched by Our Lady's infinite grace. The power doesn't come from me, it comes through me." Henri, Paulo, and Thomas also underwent profound transformations. Henri, who had lost an arm in battle years earlier, discovered that the limb had been mysteriously restored the morning after the miracle in the chapel. Paulo, who suffered from partial blindness caused by a war wound, regained his sight completely. Thomas, tormented for decades by terrifying nightmares related to the atrocities he had committed, finally found inner peace. The Catholic Church, as expected, did not remain aloof from these extraordinary events. Reports of miracles were always rigorously investigated, especially when they involved such dramatic supernatural manifestations. The Bishop of Toulouse, Guillaume de Flavicourt, sent a commission of 3 experienced theologians and a physician to investigate the claims. They arrived in Sainte Marie de Neige 2 weeks after the initial events, determined to separate truth from superstition and popular exaggeration. The commission was led by Father Augustine of Montpellier, a man known for his intellectual skepticism and scientific rigor. Accompanying him were Father Bernard of Carcassonne, a specialist in mystical phenomena, Father Jean of Narbonne, an expert in theological doctrine, and Master Philippe of Lyon, a physician trained at the University of Paris. From the outset, they approached the investigation with appropriate skepticism. They questioned dozens of witnesses, physically examined the luminous rose in Rodrigo's hand, tested the veracity of the reported cures, and spent hours studying the image of the Virgin Mary in the chapel. Father Augustine, in particular, was determined to find a rational explanation for the phenomena. He had investigated dozens of alleged miracles throughout his career, and the vast majority had proven to be the result of mass hysteria, charlatanism, or misinterpretations of natural events. "Mr. Rodrigo," he said during his first formal interrogation, "I understand that you sincerely believe you experienced something supernatural. But I must ask, isn't it possible that the combination of wine, extreme emotion, and the evocative atmosphere of the chapel created a convincing illusion?" Rodrigo, now dressed in simple clothes instead of his battle armor, responded with a calmness that contrasted sharply with his previous personality. "Father, I understand your skepticism. I myself have been a skeptic for decades. But I invite you to explain this," he said, extending his right hand. Father Augustine examined the luminous rose with a magnifying glass, tested its temperature with primitive measuring instruments available at the time, and even tried to gently scrape it with a sharp blade. The mark not only withstood all the tests, but seemed to grow brighter the more it was examined. Master Philippe conducted a thorough medical examination of Rodrigo and his 3 companions. What he discovered challenged everything he had learned in decades of medical practice. "It's impossible," he murmured, examining Henry's restored arm for the 10th time. "There are no scars, no signs of traumatic regeneration. It's as if this limb had never been lost." The investigation stretched for 3 weeks. The investigators interviewed over 100 people, documented dozens of seemingly miraculous cures, and spent countless hours trying to find natural explanations for the observed phenomena. At the end of the 3rd week, the commission met to deliberate on their findings. The meeting took place in the chapel's sacristy, a location chosen symbolically to emphasize the seriousness of the moment. Father Augustine, who had arrived as the most skeptical of the group, was the first to speak. "Brothers," he said, his voice thick with reluctant admiration, "I must confess that my faith in human reason has been severely shaken by this investigation. I have examined every aspect of these events with the rigor that our Holy Mother Church demands, and I cannot find a natural explanation for what we have witnessed." Father Bernard immediately agreed. "Rodrigo de Montcada's spiritual transformation is genuine and profound," he declared. "Men do not change so radically and permanently without true divine intervention. And the healings, Lord my God, the healings defy everything we know about the workings of the human body." Master Philippe, though not a cleric, had been deeply moved by what he observed. "As a man of science," he said, "I must admit that there are forces at work here that transcend my understanding. The rose in this man's hand is not a natural phenomenon. It emits light without generating heat, glows more intensely in response to prayers, and seems to possess healing properties that I cannot explain through known medicine." Father Jean, who had remained silent throughout most of the investigation, finally spoke. "Brothers, I believe we are witnessing an authentic miracle of the Blessed Virgin Mary. The signs are unmistakable, the transformations are genuine, and the spiritual fruit is abundant. I recommend that these events be officially recognized by the Church." The decision was unanimous. 2 weeks later, Bishop Guillaume de Flavicourt arrived in person at Sainte Marie de Neige to officially recognize the miracles. The ceremony was held in a solemn mass that attracted thousands of pilgrims from across France and beyond. The bishop, a man normally reserved and cautious when it came to supernatural phenomena, was moved to tears when Rodrigo knelt before him to receive the official blessing. "Rodrigo de Montcada," he declared loudly so the entire crowd could hear, "by this authority conferred upon us by our Lord Jesus Christ and His Most Holy Mother, we recognize the miracles manifested through you as authentic divine interventions. The rose in Rodrigo's hand shone with an intensity never before seen, radiating a light that could be seen even in broad daylight. Many in the crowd later reported feeling a tangible divine presence during that moment. May these events serve as an eternal reminder, the bishop continued, that our Blessed Virgin Mary does not abandon us, even when we abandon her. Her mercy infinitely exceeds our capacity for understanding, and her maternal love embraces even the most lost of her children. From that day on, Sainte Marie de Neige became one of the main pilgrimage centers of medieval France. The small chapel was expanded to accommodate the growing number of visitors, and an inn was built to house pilgrims who came from faraway places. Rodrigo de Moncada never again wielded a sword in war. The man who had lived off violence and conflict found his true calling in service to those in need. With the bishop's permission, he established a lay religious order dedicated to the care of the poor, the sick, and pilgrims. Henri, Paulo, and Thomas joined him, and together they built a hospice that became known throughout the region for the quality of its medical and spiritual care. The rose in his hand continued to manifest miraculous properties. People came from hundreds of miles away to be touched by it, and many received healings that defied any medical explanation. But Rodrigo always insisted that the true miracle lay not in physical healing, but in the spiritual transformation that accompanied an encounter with the divine. The body is temporary, he would tell pilgrims, but the soul is eternal. If my hand can heal your bodies, good. But if it can awaken your souls to the love of God, that is infinitely more valuable. His days followed a rigorous routine of prayer, service, and contemplation. He rose before dawn to attend Mass in the chapel, spent his mornings caring for the sick in the hospice, devoted his afternoons to prayer before the miraculous image of the Virgin Mary, and his nights to spiritual instruction for those who sought his guidance. Despite his growing fame, Rodrigo maintained a profound humility that impressed all who knew him. He slept in a simple cell, ate the same basic food served to the hospice's poor, and wore coarse cloth clothes that he mended himself when necessary. Is this extraordinary transformation of a lost man into renewed faith touching your heart? Be sure to subscribe and turn on notifications to follow more authentic stories that can transform your spiritual life. The 20 years that followed the initial miracle were marked by a continuous succession of extraordinary events. The chapel of Sainte Marie de Neige became the scene of supernatural manifestations that attracted the attention of theologians, doctors, and curious onlookers from all over Europe. The image of the Virgin Mary began to display signs of its own life with increasing frequency. Her tears, which initially appeared only in moments of great danger to the community, became more common, especially during periods of intense collective prayer. In 1251, during a devastating drought that threatened to destroy all the region's crops, the image wept continuously for 3 days. At the end of the 3rd day, it began to rain, and the rain lasted just long enough to save the crops without causing flooding. In 1254, when an epidemic of bubonic plague struck the neighboring villages, Sainte Marie de Neige remained completely untouched by the disease. Doctors who came to study the phenomenon could find no natural explanation for the local population's immunity. In 1259, during an attack by bandits who attempted to loot the chapel and steal the valuable ex-votos left by pilgrims, witnesses reported that the image of the Virgin Mary emitted a light so intense that it temporarily blinded the invaders, allowing them to be easily captured by the local population. Rodrigo was present at all these events, always attributing the miracles to the intercession of the Virgin Mary and never taking any personal credit. The rose in his hand grew progressively brighter with each passing year, as if accumulating spiritual power through his works of charity and devotion. But the most extraordinary miracle was yet to come. In the year 1267, exactly 20 years after his first encounter with the Virgin Mary, Rodrigo experienced a vision that surpassed in intensity and clarity anything he had experienced previously. It was the feast of the Assumption of Our Lady, and the chapel was filled with pilgrims who had come from as far away as Rome and Santiago de Compostela. Rodrigo had spent the entire day fasting and praying, preparing himself spiritually for the celebration. During the solemn evening mass, at the precise moment of the consecration of the host, something extraordinary happened. The entire chapel was enveloped in a golden light that came neither from the sun, nor from candles, nor from any earthly source. It was a light that seemed to emanate from the very stones of the building, from the air they breathed, from every speck of dust suspended in the air. Rodrigo saw the Virgin Mary no longer as a carved image, but as a living, radiant presence hovering a few feet above the altar. She wore a cloak of stars that shimmered like the Milky Way, and her face radiated a beauty that transcended any human concept of beauty. But he wasn't the only one to see her. All the people present in the chapel, more than 300, witnessed the apparition simultaneously. Men, women, and children fell to their knees in spontaneous adoration, many weeping with pure emotion. The Virgin spoke, and her voice echoed not only in the ears, but directly in the hearts of all present. "Beloved children," she said, "I have come to confirm before all of you what I revealed to Rodrigo 20 years ago. My love for you is eternal and unconditional. There is no sin so great that it cannot be forgiven. There is no soul so lost that it cannot be saved. There is no heart so hardened that it cannot be transformed." She extended her hands toward the crowd, and rays of golden light emanated from her palms, touching every person present. Many later reported feelings of instant physical and spiritual healing. "Rodrigo," she said, turning specifically to the man who had become her special instrument on earth, "your journey in this world is almost over. But your work will continue through those you have inspired and those you will inspire throughout the centuries." The apparition lasted only a few minutes, but its effects were lasting and profound. Many of those present radically changed their lives after that night, abandoning worldly careers to dedicate themselves to the service of God and their neighbors. After the great vision of 1267, Rodrigo entered the final phase of his earthly life. Now over 60 years old, an advanced age by the standards of the time, he began preparing for his departure from this world with the same dedication and meticulousness that had characterized his conversion. He chose and trained successors to continue the work of the hospice, established detailed rules for the maintenance of the religious order he had founded, and carefully organized all the records of the miracles he had witnessed over the decades. His final years were marked by an intensification of his contemplative life. He spent long hours in silent prayer before the miraculous image of the Virgin Mary, and many pilgrims reported seeing him levitate during these sessions of profound prayer. The rose in his right hand had grown in luminosity until it became visible even in daylight. Doctors who examined it discovered that it had become three-dimensional, projecting slightly above the surface of his skin as if it were a real rose made of solid light. Henri, Paolo, and Thomas remained faithful by his side until the end. The three men, now also elderly, had become respected figures in the region for their spiritual wisdom and dedication to those in need. In 1274, Rodrigo began to have regular visions of the Virgin Mary, which came to prepare him for his final transition. She showed him visions of the heaven that awaited him, and he shared them with his closest companions. "It is more beautiful than anything we can imagine," he would say, his eyes shining with an inner light. "And our Blessed Mother is there, waiting to welcome us as the loving mother she always was." Rodrigo de Moncada died on the morning of August 15, 1275, the feast of the Assumption of the Virgin Mary, a coincidence no one considered coincidental. He had spent the previous night in a prayer vigil in the chapel, accompanied by Henri, Paolo, Thomas, and some of the monks of the order he had founded. Around 5 in the morning, he rose from his kneeling position before the altar and addressed those present in a clear, serene voice. "My dear brothers," he said, "the hour has come. Our most holy mother has come to seek me." Everyone looked around, but saw nothing but the morning shadows of the chapel. Then Rodrigo smiled with an expression of indescribable joy. "She is here," he whispered. "As beautiful as the first day she spoke to me. And she is not alone. I see my mother, my father, and so many others who have gone before me." He lay on the floor of the chapel, his hands crossed over his chest. The luminous rose in his right palm began to glow with an intensity that illuminated the entire building. "Remember," he said, his voice growing fainter but still audible. "There is nothing to fear in death when one lives in union with God. And Our Lady never abandons us." His last words were, "Hail Mary, full of grace." At the exact moment his heart stopped beating, the rose in his hand emitted a flash of light so intense it could be seen from miles away. Then, gradually, it began to fade until it disappeared completely, leaving only the normal skin where it had shone for 28 years. But something extraordinary happened immediately after his death. Rodrigo's body showed no signs of decomposition. On the contrary, his skin acquired a soft luminosity and a heavenly perfume, the same that had been smelled on the night of his conversion, emanated from his body. Rodrigo de Montcada's funeral was one of the most attended events of the 13th century in the Pyrenees region. People traveled from all over Europe to pay their last respects to the man who had been transformed from blasphemer to saint through the miraculous intervention of the Virgin Mary. Dom Guillaume de Flavicourt, now 80 years old, presided over the funeral ceremony. In his homily, he declared, "Rodrigo de Montcada taught us that it is never too late to change, never too late to find God, and never too late to become what we were created to be." He began his adult life as a man lost in the darkness of skepticism and violence. But he ended it as a beacon of light that guided thousands of souls closer to the Creator. Rodrigo's body was buried in a special crypt built beneath the altar of the chapel of Sainte Marie de Neige. Immediately after his burial, miracles began to be reported at his tomb. People who prayed at his grave received healings, spiritual visions, and profound conversions. Henri, Paulo, and Thomas continued their master's work for many years. The hospice grew and developed, becoming one of the leading centers of medical and spiritual care in medieval France. The religious order Rodrigo had founded spread to other regions, establishing houses of charity and prayer in dozens of cities. Rodrigo's story was carefully documented by the scribal monks of the time, ensuring that future generations would know the details of his extraordinary transformation. These documents, preserved in the church archives, provided the basis for countless theological studies on the nature of conversion and miracles. Even centuries after Rodrigo's death, the chapel of Sainte Marie de Neige continued to be the scene of extraordinary events. The image of the Virgin Mary retained its miraculous properties, continuing to weep in times of need and perform cures that defied medical understanding. During the 100 Years' War in the 14th century, the chapel served as a refuge for hundreds of people fleeing violence. Soldiers on both sides of the conflict reported being unable to attack the site, as if an invisible force prevented them from approaching with hostile intentions. In the 15th century, during the Black Death epidemic that ravaged Europe, Sainte Marie de Neige again remained untouched by the disease. Physicians of the time documented the phenomenon but were unable to find natural explanations for the local population's immunity. During the Protestant Reformation of the 16th century, when many Catholic churches were attacked and desecrated, the chapel remained protected. Several iconoclastic expeditions headed to the site with the intention of destroying the superstitious image of the Virgin Mary, but all were mysteriously discouraged from continuing before reaching their destination. In the 18th century, during the French Revolution, when most religious symbols were systematically destroyed, the chapel of Sainte Marie de Neige survived virtually intact. The local revolutionaries, many of whom had grown up listening to Rodrigo's stories, could not bring themselves to desecrate the sacred site. In 1847, exactly 600 years after the original miracle, Pope Pius IX officially venerated Rodrigo de Montcada, declaring him blessed and establishing August 15 as his liturgical feast day, appropriately coinciding with the Assumption of the Virgin Mary. The beatification ceremony attracted more than 50,000 pilgrims to Sainte Marie de Neige. During the solemn Mass, numerous supernatural phenomena were reported, including instantaneous healings, luminous apparitions, and the heavenly perfume that had characterized Rodrigo's presence in life. In the 20th century, despite scientific advances and growing secularism, the chapel continued to attract pilgrims from around the world. Modern physicians documented healings that continued to defy rational explanation, and psychologists studied the profound spiritual transformations experienced by many visitors. During World War II, the region was occupied by German forces, but the chapel remained respected even by the most anti-religious soldiers. Several wartime accounts mention Nazi officers arriving with hostile intentions, only to leave completely transformed by experiences they could not explain. In 1947, during the celebrations marking the 7th centenary of the original miracle, Pope Pius XII elevated Rodrigo de Montcada to the dignity of saint, officially recognizing his sanctity and establishing his perpetual cult in the Universal Church. The story of Saint Rodrigo de Montcada and his transformative encounter with the Virgin Mary transcends the centuries because it touches on fundamental truths of the human condition. It is the story of how divine love can reach even the most hardened hearts, how mercy can overcome justice, and how grace can bring about transformations that seem impossible. For Christians, the story serves as a powerful reminder that salvation is available to all, regardless of how far they have strayed from God. Rodrigo was not just a skeptic. He was an active blasphemer who publicly mocked the faith. If he could be touched by divine grace, then truly no one is beyond the possibility of redemption. For skeptics, the story offers an intriguing challenge. The historical documents supporting the events are extensive and detailed, the witnesses were numerous and reputable, and the ecclesiastical investigations were conducted with scientific rigor by the standards of the time. Even those who do not accept the supernatural interpretation of the events must recognize that something extraordinary happened in that chapel in the 13th century. The figure of the Virgin Mary, as presented in this story, embodies the ideal of divine maternal love, patient, forgiving, always ready to welcome back lost children. Her response to Rodrigo's blasphemy was not punishment, but compassion. Her reaction to his anger was not retaliation, but healing. Today, more than 800 years after that transformative night in 1247, the chapel of Sainte Marie de Neige still stands proudly on the hill overlooking the small French village. The miraculous image of the Virgin Mary remains on the same altar where Rodrigo experienced his extraordinary conversion. Thousands of pilgrims continue to visit the site each year, many seeking physical healing, others seeking spiritual peace, and some simply driven by curiosity about one of the best documented miracles in medieval history. The tomb of Saint Rodrigo, located in the crypt beneath the main altar, has become a place of intense prayer and silent contemplation. Visitors often report feelings of deep peace and spiritual clarity when praying at the tomb of the former soldier-turned-saint. Henri, Paulo, and Thomas were later beatified by the Catholic Church, recognized as Rodrigo's fellow saints and authentic witnesses to his miraculous transformation. Their tombs, located in the cemetery adjacent to the chapel, have also become places of pilgrimage. The religious order founded by Rodrigo still exists today, with houses scattered throughout Europe and the Americas. The members of the order, known as the Brothers of the Luminous Rose, dedicate their lives to caring for the poor, the sick, and the spiritually needy, continuing the work begun by their founder 8 centuries ago. But perhaps Saint Rodrigo de Montcada's most important legacy is not the physical miracles or the institutions he established. His true gift to humanity is living proof that genuine spiritual transformation is always possible, that no life is beyond redemption, and that an authentic encounter with the divine can change not only individuals but the course of history. In a world often dominated by skepticism and hopelessness, the story of the soldier who mocked the Virgin Mary and found in her not the condemnation he deserved, but the love he needed, continues to offer a message of eternal hope. As he himself wrote in his spiritual memoirs, dictated shortly before his death, "I learned that God does not love us because we are good, but so that we can become good. Our blessed Mother does not wait for us to be perfect before accepting us. She accepts us so that we can become perfect. This is the truth that transformed my life and that can transform any life. Divine love is not conditional on our goodness, but is the source of all goodness we can manifest." This is the eternal message of the soldier who found more than he sought on that dark night in 1247. Rodrigo de Montcada climbed the hill seeking to prove that God did not exist. He came down as living proof that God not only exists, but loves us with an intensity that transcends our capacity for comprehension. And so ends the extraordinary story of a man who discovered that sometimes we must lose everything we believe in to find what is worth believing in. If this story touched your heart and strengthened your faith, it fulfilled its purpose. Saint Rodrigo de Montcada awaits in heaven all those who, like him, managed to find their way home through the infinite mercy of the Virgin Mary. Hail Mary, full of grace, the Lord is with thee.